The subject that you're a specialist in is so near and dear to my heart. I'm wondering if you would tell our audience about your research and also how you got started in this field.
Oh wow, well that could be a long story, but I focus on the neurobiological mechanisms by which meditation improves health outcomes. And so we want to understand exactly what's going on in the brain and in the body as a result of meditation practice. And there are profound changes that we observe. And I focus a lot on the idea of the self and how the self can transform specifically, both from a more theoretical perspective, and then how can you represent the self and different aspects of self-processing in the brain, and following how those particular maybe networks in the brain are shifting as a result of meditation or with psychedelics, and looking at those common pathways by which we can transform ourselves and by which we can transcend the self and really flourish as human beings.
What is the overlap between those two pathways? Are they completely overlapping or partially?
You know, it's amazing actually when you start to really take a granular kind of approach to understanding the phenomenology by which we have deep meditative experiences. The phenomenology is very similar. So when we talk about self-transcendence, we have to first step back and really understand what the self is, right? So if we can understand the self from this sort of complex of I, me, mine, right? So there's the I, the agentic I, the experience of being behind our eyes, and then there's the me, which is really the different personas that we take on. Me as a father, as a scientist, as a skier. So everyone has these different personas. And then there's the mind, which is all the possessions, all the things you accumulate, right? So here's this complex, and you can think of it as like one big house, right? And you're in this house and you have different rooms and they're all aspects of yourself. But what we have to realize is that you can be attached to some of those aspects of your house, of yourself. And the attachment leads to a roller coaster of emotions, pushing away the things you don't like, trying to just grasp and hold on to things we do like. It leads to a duality, which is the most critical part of it, which is we realize that we're not, that we're individuals, and we cling to this idea of being an individual, that we fail to realize that there's others, right? And it creates this dichotomy between self and other. And that causes conflict, right? So we have great conflict in the world right now between polarized sort of viewpoints on this is me and this is what my belief system is, and this is you and this is what your belief system is, and that othering leads to suffering. If we don't realize that there's a non-dual way to approach our experience, then it just leads to continual dissatisfaction and suffering. And when we realize that there's a interdependent nature of ourselves with lots of houses in the neighborhood and the universe around us, then we can transcend this feeling of just being attached to one entity, one individual, and dissolving the sense of self and the boundaries between self and other. That allows us to transcend that roller coaster of emotions, reduce our suffering, feeling of spaciousness. And that spaciousness gives us a sense of peace, a sense of satisfaction, and we start to flourish as human beings.
So one of the things that I've been obsessed about lately is physiological biosynchrony. And I've been thinking a lot about, like you said, the challenges that are going on in the world right now, and all of the othering that's happening. With your work with meditation and also looking at the mind with psychedelics, are these two things that could just getting more connected? How does our body and our brain support that?
Yeah, building off of the phenomenology that we're experiencing when we're in those transcendent states, when we experience non-dual states of awareness. The typical phenomenology is reported in questionnaires that we ask people, like the different subjective measures that sort of report on experiences like, what does it feel like to be in that non-dual state of awareness? Because it takes a lot of training to go through meditation. With psychedelics, you can have one dose, 25 milligrams of psilocybin, and you can have a profound experience that shifts your perspective outside of the house, right? You're outside of the self. It's the meta perspective. And as soon as you have that meta perspective, you realize how interconnected we all are. And having that interconnection feels a dissolution of self, right? We created a model, actually, of what self-transcendence is, and it has two components. One is this feeling of the dissolving of the sense of self, a dissolution of self, a dissolving of the ego. And then the second component is a feeling of connection, a feeling of unity. Right? So if we take that experience, it sometimes feels as oceanic boundlessness is one of the characteristics that are measured in psychedelic research. And it actually correlates with the amount of the dosage of psychedelics that you're taking. And the more active that it engages with particular receptors in our brain, like the 5-HT2A, the serotonin, or specific serotonin receptor, the more activation that you have of that receptor, the more feelings of oceanic boundlessness, the more feelings of connection that you experience. So there's a relationship between the phenomenology that you get from taking psychedelics, the experience of non-duality and self-transcendence, and the same with meditation. Once we get to a deeper state of concentration or a more profound sense of open awareness, we reach that non-dual state where we can see very similar substrates in the brain and report subjectively. So in the brain, it looks very unique. For meditation, what we found, at least from EEG correlates, is that if you're in this non-referential state of compassion, for example, where you're wishing all beings to be free of suffering, that activates certain frequency or types of activity in your brain. It's called gamma band frequencies. So there's a very specific shift in your brain that is a marker now for this non-dual state of awareness.
So we have really clear markers on non-dual states.
It's not that clear. So this is where we're starting to create a library of really markers, right? Of what is the phenomenology and how is it related to these biological markers. So we have one for meditation, which is the gamma band, and it's not even that convincing. It's just one marker. The one it is very convincing is with psychedelics, and it relates to this entropic brain hypothesis, where you have lots of different networks in your brain, right? So let's just say there's 10 different networks, and one of them is very specific that relates to the self. It's called the default mode network.
Yeah.
People talk about it often. And when it is active, we're typically ruminating or reflecting on ourselves, and it's often very negative in interpretation, and it's very focused on ourselves, nothing about the other, right?
Yeah, most people's it would be great if your rumination was like, wow, you really did a good job in that conversation.
Yeah, well, and it's an interesting point because even if you are thinking positive thoughts, you'll still have activity actually in that network. Because it's very focused on just evaluating the world or reflecting on itself. So it's impartial to valence. It can be positive or negative, right? But the point is that in psychedelics, you have decreased connectivity within that network. That's the first thing that we see. So it's kind of breaking up loosening up our sort of focus on self.
Yeah.
And then you see what's really profound is what's called entropy, or a breakdown of the modularity of these networks. These 10 networks that we're referring to, are very specific because they're brain regions that fire and wire together, right? And that's why they're networks, and they're independent. But they're connected in some ways, and they're modular because they're independent. And when you take a psychedelic, the modularity breaks down. There's more entropy, more uncertainty, less independent or silos of these networks, and they're heavily interconnected. And that entropic brain hypothesis is really another biomarker for this experience of self-transcendence.
So for someone who is thinking about or actively meditating, or let's say they haven't started meditating yet, and whether for therapy or anything else, they haven't experienced psychedelics, how should they think about the two things going together?
Yeah, well, it's really coming down to the I, me, mine complex again. If you start to take, to sort of reflect inwardly on who your self is, what is your identity, who are you as a person, right? And you can even think of that house metaphor, right? And every room in the house is a different persona. This is you as a interviewer, this is you at home, maybe as a parent, this is you as a spouse or significant other. You have all these different identities, right? And so it's different rooms in your house. If you start to get this meta perspective, that is the key to dissolving the sense of self and transcending the self, so there's dissolving the boundaries between self and other.
But as a tool, so as a tool set moving towards my meta house.
Exactly.
Are you saying then that different tools are for different senses of self?
Really just whatever tool you can use to break down the barriers of your house, to feel that they're more permeable, that they're not hard walls, that you can actually move beyond those walls, that we have very limited walls, that there's more connection and interdependence across the different houses in your neighborhood. Even your neighbor, like, have you ever talked to you? When's the last time you actually reached over to your neighbor and actually said something? It's amazing that I always used to tell my wife, like, how do you expect Israel and Palestine to get to actually get along if we can't even get along with our neighbors, right? Like that, it starts with the self and our experience of the self and how we relate to others. So if we can use psychedelics and meditation together as tools to transcend the self and experience a feeling of unity with even just our neighbors, even the people around us, the people we love or sometimes we don't feel connected to.
Yeah.
So nurturing those connections and feeling the connection of being humans. I saw the Dalai Lama in last October in Dharamsala, and the one thing that he kept emphasizing, the one thing he just said over and over again, was that fundamentally, we are all the same as human beings. We have many differences, but fundamentally, we have to realize that there are more similarities than there are differences. And that is the only way humanity will survive.
Yeah, I agree completely. So, a 10-second message to whoever's watching this video. What is the most important thing you want them to know about your work and the times that we're in?
I would love to talk about some of the work that we're doing, looking at the lymphatic system of the brain. We have some great work that we're studying how meditating actually benefits the body by reducing inflammation across the body and the brain.
Wow.
And so that's something that I think is really cool. I think it's really helpful to better understand that there's something of substance to doing these practices, that it's not just, for a bunch of hippies to do and sitting around with a drum circle. It's really something that's has to be thought of as part of medicine, part of healing. And I think if we can all focus on taking that meta perspective, then we're going to certainly survive and flourish as human beings. It's about connecting to the people around us and moving beyond the barriers of I, me, and mine. So this is where we really are going to transcend and flourish as a community, as one humanity, when we can dissolve the sense of self and feel that the boundaries between self and other are going to be dissolved.
Yeah. And one thing that I would add to that, I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean to be human in the age of AI? And we've got this metaphor of man as computer or man as machine, man as computer that's now turning into man as cyborg. And I think it's leading us into a cul-de-sac, and because it's the wrong metaphor, and so I think that your work and the understanding of self and then how we think about our sense of self, that's the path to another metaphor that I think leads us to a different place. So I think we're kind of in the place where your work and what many other people have been working on too, we all stand in long lineages. That's the work of this time. So
absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that sense of connection is going to have to be nurtured, even with AI, taking over. So I'm so glad that you're even thinking about the sense of self and how we can leverage this experience of transcendence in your work as well. It's powerful. So my experience with BrainMind has been amazing. There's been a lot of great talks. Judd Brewer came up and talked about different apps that he has to help using mindfulness and meditation specifically for reducing craving and addiction, and talked about some of the challenges that there are for scaling those types of experiences to the masses. We had Ali Crum, who talked about the significance of mindset and how important perspective is and perception on changing our physiology. Just by perceiving our sense of self or our stresses in life, it can be perceived as a threat or as a challenge. And if we are perceiving things as a challenge, it's much more likely that it's going to benefit us. Jay Sanguinetti talked about modulating the brain through focused ultrasound, which is a non-invasive way to stimulate the brain and perhaps induce a feeling of equanimity, an experience of equanimity, which is a critical part of the meditative practice. So if technology like that can augment our traditional experience of sitting on a cushion, that's great, wonderful. So we have technology from stimulation side, we have a focus on perception and mindset, and we have technology and apps that are really sort of driving our ability to scale these kinds of experiences for everybody. So it's been a wonderful conference so far. I think we're learning a lot about how to bring technology and science together and really bridge the gap, right? The translational gap of the science into applications.